Welcome to a webinar with the New Mexico Small Business Development Center Network's Gateway to Exporting program. My name is Dante DiGregorio, and I'm a consultant with the Gateway to Exporting program, as well as a professor at UNM's Anderson School of Management. So this is the second of a three-part series on doing business in Mexico, and in this part I'll be focusing on providing a brief economic history with emphasis on recent economic developments. Now, in the case of any country, it's important to understand a little bit of history when you're doing business in the country. I think in Mexico, the past casts a particularly long shadow over the present and is very relevant for doing business. So I'm going to run through most of this very quickly. Very briefly on the pre-Columbian era. One important thing to point out is that from basically the beginning of time, Mexico City, the area of the Valley of Mexico, has been a focal point, if not the focal point, of civilization in Mesoamerica. So it's been the hub of Mexican society, along with some other hubs like that of the Maya. When the Spaniards arrived around 1500, there were about 100,000 inhabitants in the area of Mexico City, about 30 million in Greater Mexico. They encountered a society that was very advanced in terms of architecture, irrigation, engineering, writing. In terms of the economy, what was in place was a feudal system that wasn't too different from that found in Europe at the time, in the sense that there were these chiefs or caciques who were able to exact tribute from the masses who basically worked on their behalf. Over roughly 3 centuries, Spain controlled Mexico, put in place an imperialist economy consistent with the ideals of the Spanish Empire, oriented towards exporting from Spain to the economies and to the colonies, and using the colonies to extract wealth out of those colonies. So the famous quest for gold and other valuables. In a social cultural sense, I think the salient thing is the emergence of a distinct mestizo Mexican culture, whether you call it La Raza or whatever you want to call it. What emerged was a culture, a third culture that came out of the Spanish and indigenous origins, and reflects those origins, but really is its own distinct Mexican culture and identity. And this is something that, to at least a certain degree, distinguishes Mexico from the rest of Latin America and makes it unique. Now, Mexico gained independence in the early 1800s from Spain, but really the first 100 years of their independence was what I would call an incomplete independence, in that the Spanish control was displaced, but in economic terms and in political terms, a feudal system remained, and this was a system that was dominated by these regional power brokers. This term caudillo is still used today, and so the arguably the most important era in Mexican history was not its independence from Spain, but was the revolution, which came a century later, and it happens to be a century ago now. This was the first great social revolution of the modern era, predating the Bolshevik Revolution, and the ideals in the Mexican Revolution were very radical and espoused a fairly socialist agenda. Lots of colorful characters involved, some of whom are named here, which I won't go into. But basically, they ousted a regime of Porfirio Diaz, which was economically progressive, but was one that perpetuated a structure whereby a small number of people benefited from the work of the masses. This social revolution evolved over time, and in fact it never really ended, and instead was institutionalized in the form of a political party known as the PRI, which is still a powerful force today, the PRI, the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution. And what resulted was an economic system that was inspired by these very socialist ideals of the revolution, and yet in fact was patterned after this colonial system. So you got the socialist rhetoric, but when you dug past that, you found that you still had very unequal development, a very closed economy, and an increasingly closed economy over the decades. Another thing I'll point out that some people are surprised by from the outside is how secular modern Mexico is in terms of its government. Mexico is a very overwhelmingly Catholic society. More than 90% of Mexicans self-identify as being Catholic. And the Catholic Church, in a cultural and social sense, is very important. But following the period right after the revolution, Mexico has had a very secular system of government and economy. So they haven't had problems of separation of church and state, but have had some problems with the poor separation of firm and state, in the sense that they had a government that really intruded into all economic activities, either through directly owning those activities or by over-regulating privately run activities. This all changed following a period of what we call the sexennial crises, series of economic crises that coincided with the end of Mexico's 6-year presidential terms, running from 1976 until 1994. Now these crises, each one had some different characteristics, different reasons that it arose and so forth, but they shared some common characteristics, in particular massive devaluation of the peso, a major contraction of the economy, and wiping out wealth, particularly at the middle class, the developing middle class level. This pattern recurred, and it in the 1980s it got particularly bad. This was also a period when Mexico had the fortune or misfortune of striking oil, and like many countries that strike oil, this tended to exacerbate some of the underlying problems. For instance, there was already an ample amount of corruption present within both the government and these economic sectors, a lot of which were closely tied to the government. Well, once the oil was struck, the president at the time, López Portillo, declared that his job was to administer the abundance, which meant basically sharing the wealth with his family and friends. And so you ended up with a state sector that was bloated and corrupt, a economic sector that was largely owned by the government, or if it was privately held, it was with close ties to the government. And so it was a system that was unsustainable, and over the course of 20 years, a series of technocratic presidents undertook a series of dramatic reforms to reshape Mexico's economy. This started with Miguel de la Madrid, who was president during what's called the lost decade of the 1980s. It's called that because Mexico, and in fact Latin America in general, finished off the decade no better and arguably far worse than they started it. He put in place a series of reforms that began to stabilize the economy and began to open the economy. That was continued under Salinas de Gortari. Mexico joined GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, under de la Madrid. And then under Salinas, NAFTA was negotiated, the economy began to boom, there was renewed hope, this resurgence of the middle class, but then at the end of his sexenio, some shattered dreams and the so-called errors of December, in that December 1994, Mexico's peso lost about half of its value, and initiated a crisis that they really were not able to escape from until the new millennium. Salinas was followed by Cedillo, a sort of accidental president in that the first candidate was assassinated. Cedillo was very much a technocrat, was often perceived as being weak, but in fact, during his sexenio, a lot of these reforms that began starting with De la Madrid were continued and finalized in many respects. Not as glamorous reforms as say, NAFTA, but Mexico really transformed itself by the end of his sexenio into a very export-oriented, open economy, but of course one that continued to still have some challenges and problems. Some details on these economic reforms of between 1980 and 2000. If we look at the major areas in which a government impacts its economy, in terms of monetary and fiscal policy, inflation at the beginning of the 80s had begun to exceed 100% per year. By the end of this period, it had fallen to below 5%. Mexico put in place a series of measures to ensure balanced budgets, and there's basically a balanced budget requirement at the federal level, with only some exceptions in Mexico. And so Mexico's maintained a very balanced budget, unlike many other countries. In terms of deregulation and privatization, this is perhaps one of the more dramatic areas. The government went from running many different aspects of industry to turning around and privatizing those banks, the railroads, telecommunications, industry ranging from steel to aquaculture to food distribution, to mining and all sorts of other economic activities. The government put in place a series of laws protecting foreign direct investment and franchises in the early 1990s. This led to an explosion in franchising activity, and it also led to increased transparency and more effective competition, although not perfect competition, and that's something I'll address later. The third broad area is that of trade liberalization. Mexico, in a very short period of time, went from having a very closed economy to a very strong export orientation, which you see today in Mexico's economy. They joined GATT, which is now known as the World Trade Organization, in 1986. At that point, maximum tariff levels fell from 100% to 20%. Average tariff levels fell from 20% to 10%. Following Mexico's accession into the WTO, or GATT at that time, Mexico negotiated a series of free trade agreements, including NAFTA, which encompasses the US, Canada, and Mexico, as well as many other trade agreements. And now Mexico has more trade agreements than any other country out there. But under NAFTA, virtually all tariffs were eliminated, many of them immediately in 1994, and then some gradually, so that by 2003, nearly all tariffs on trade between US, Canada, and Mexico, and most, if not all, non-tariff barriers have been eliminated between the three countries. So, as Mexico entered this new millennium, there was a lot of hope built around really a new Mexico in many respects. The biggest part of this change was political. After the PRI controlled the government for over 70 years, in 2000, a former Coca-Cola executive from the center-right PAN party, sort of a Christian Democrat party, was elected president. He's a figure who I like to sort of compare to Obama in the sense that he campaigned on the basis of change and on hope. And he built up people's expectations dramatically for expecting dramatic change. Wasn't always able to deliver on that change. unfortunately, Mexico is now experiencing that with political pluralism, which you have in most democracies, that often turns into political gridlock. So, looking over the past decade, the PAN party, right of center, has controlled the presidency. The PRI, the old party of center left, has continued to dominate the largest share of the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies in Mexico's bicameral legislative system. And then the PRD, which is a leftist party, left of center party, controls many governorships and the important mayor of Mexico City, Mexico's largest city. So Fox wasn't quite able to deliver on these very high expectations that he built. He passed the torch to Felipe Calderon, who's finishing off his term this year. The political gridlock continues. This has been exacerbated by the upheaval surrounding drug-related violence. Calderon's administration has placed a heavy emphasis on combating drug violence, and in some respects that has sort of diverted attention and resources away from other activities. So now this year in 2012, we head into an election where there's a fair amount of uncertainty. It seems that the front runner for now is from the PRI, a fellow named Enrique Peña Nieto, who was governor of the state of Mexico, which surrounds Mexico City. I'm not exactly sure what will happen with the elections, but I do feel quite confident that it won't be a return to the past, in that as I mentioned, there were these sexennial crises. Every 6 years, the economy fell apart. Really, that cycle was broken in 2000. It didn't come back in 2006, and I can't imagine it happening again in 2012. So really, we have entered a new era, one that is not perfectly stable, but represents considerably more stability in political and economic terms than in the past. And what we have now in place is also one that more accurately reflects Mexico's official name as the Estados Unidos Mexicanos. Mexico's constitution and political system in government is set up as a federalist system, much like the United States. However, that was on paper. In practice, Mexico has continued to have a very centralized system whereby all the power, all the decision-making was kept in Mexico City. If you were involved in doing business with Pemex in the state of Veracruz, you'd have to go to Mexico City to meet the decision makers. If you were involved in an infrastructure project in the border state of Chihuahua, you would probably have to go to Mexico City again. These days, because you have the pluralism, because starting with Cedillo's administration, there was this willingness to push the locus of decision making down to the states and the municipios, which are municipalities, sort of like counties in the United States. You now have a system that is truly federalist and more decentralized decision-making and power. Well, looking over the last three sexenios in terms of economic performance, I had mentioned December 94 was the beginning of the big crisis, capital C. Mexico's economy contracted dramatically in 95. During the rest of the Cedillo sexenio, Mexico maintained consistent and fairly significant economic growth, which in the numbers, it looks impressive. I think in practice, it's a little different in that real wages still had not recuperated to their 94 levels by the end of the decade. And this large group of people who were feeling like they were middle class, really in early 1990s, were not able to return to that level of well-being by the end of the millennium there. So then power shifted over to the PAN. We're finishing off the second Panista sexenio. And in economic terms, at least in terms of overall economic growth, the record's been pretty patchy. Growth has been fairly anemic, particularly when you compare it to the big emerging markets like India and China and even Brazil, which have experienced growth rates consistently above 8% or even above 10, 12%. So Mexico has not experienced that type of growth. However, in spite of the modest economic growth, over the past decade, the middle class really has begun to emerge or re-emerge. Poverty rates have fallen very considerably over the past decade, particularly if you consider that the economy really hasn't grown all that much. Mexico is still a fairly unequal, still has a fairly unequal distribution of income and wealth, but less so. And when you consider that there are many other countries out there, including China, the United States, many others, that are becoming increasingly unequal, less equal, Mexico is a bit of an exception in this case. The lower to upper middle class now accounts for about 60% of the population. And I think this is very significant because a lot of people still have the idea of Mexico as a country where a small number of people control all of the country's economic resources. Without a doubt, there still is that small segment of society that is the ultra wealthy and very powerful. But in addition to that segment, you now have this new segment of over half of the population that can be classified as being middle class, that has increasing access to consumer credit, something that 20 years ago really was unheard of, and increasing access to a wide range of goods and services. Just to give you some example, in terms of airlines, rather than having just the two state-owned airline companies of the past, Mexico now has a bunch of low-cost airlines that are providing service to people who in many cases are flying for the first time, or at least over the past 5 years or so have started to fly for the first time. Orthodontics I mentioned because this is something I've noticed in my travels to Mexico over the past 5 years. I'm surprised how many people I see. Sort of the typical profile would be maybe the 30 to 40 something female with braces. You see an awful lot of these people now in Mexico. And this to me is a reflection of the fact that 20 years ago these people really were not in an economic class that would allow them to get braces and take care of more advanced dental needs. And today, that is something that's accessible to most of the population. Higher education is another good example. There's been an explosion of private sector activity in the area. So I don't want to suggest that there are no challenges left for Mexico. In fact, there are a wide range of economic, social, and political challenges that are lingering. First off, the famous quote from Porfirio Diaz, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." Proximity to the United States represents a huge opportunity. It also presents a number of problems when you have this 300 million pound gorilla to the north that is, in many respects, in many areas, far more competitive economically. So Mexico's economy has become very dependent upon the United States. Until recently, Mexico's exports, over 80% of Mexico's exports and slightly lesser percentage of Mexico's imports involve the United States. These amounts have been declining somewhat, but Mexico continues to remain very dependent upon the United States. When the 2008 economic crisis began in the United States, that certainly had a huge impact on Mexico. Mexico avoided contagion from the big emerging market crises, but it didn't avoid contagion from the U.S. crisis. Mexico's economy remains heavily dependent on oil, which continues to account for roughly a third of government revenue, as well as the maquiladoras, or twin plants, which we have a separate presentation on, and exports. So instead of building economic growth off of growth in domestic demand, Mexico has become very dependent on export markets. When those markets dry up, as they did in 2008, Mexico certainly pays the price. In spite of some improvements, Mexico continues to experience relatively unequal living standards, poverty rates that are higher than they should be, and fairly stagnant real wages. Real wages in the early 2000s finally recuperated in real terms to their period, to the point before the 1980s. Most of us are familiar with the drug-related problems in terms of the violence, lawlessness, challenge to the rule of law, kidnappings, and so forth, which I've addressed in the previous presentation. And this is a major issue. In economic terms, the cost has been somewhat limited in the ballpark of 1 or 2% of GDP, but in a social sense, this has presented a dramatic cost and challenge to society. Immigration is an issue that from the United States is often presented as a challenge to the United States, but it equally presents a challenge to Mexico in that it represents the loss of some of Mexico's most motivated and capable people. This is particularly a problem with the loss of educated people and the sort of the human capital that drives economic growth. There are additional issues associated with natural environment, water. Mexico's a country that has too much water in some places and too little water in a lot of other places, and relatively few places with just the right amount. There are a number of indigenous issues associated with high poverty and poor standard of living in indigenous communities. This is exemplified by Chiapas, where there was an uprising in '94, which has tapered off, but those underlying problems have not. There are continuing challenges to Mexico's competitiveness, which will require additional legal, tax, and labor reforms, which have not been fully implemented to a large degree due to the political gridlock. And then finally, Mexico, while it has privatized its economy, and in some cases those sectors went from being public monopolies to being private monopolies, the most famous of which is Telmex, the formerly state-owned telecommunications company, which continues to dominate most areas of telecommunications as a private monopoly, basically. There's been a fair amount of deregulation in transportation sectors and electricity and so forth, but there are additional reforms that are needed if Mexico is going to enhance its international competitiveness. So hopefully this presentation has provided you an overview of some of the historical and recent economic issues that impact doing business in Mexico. On this slide you see a list of additional resources, including those of the Gateway to Exporting program. You'll find a series of additional webinars available at that site, and other resources available through the SBDC's Gateway to Exporting site, as well as the Small Business Administration and Department of Commerce. Thank you for your time.